Many business owners believe they'll one day sell their company and walk away with millions using the lifetime capital gains exemption. But in reality, the vast majority of small business owners here in Canada never do. In this episode, we're going to break down a real-world example from a tech consulting entrepreneur and listener of the show making about $1 million of top-line revenue per year, only to discover that maybe her business may not be as saleable as she may have once thought. We'll walk through the miscalculations around profit margins, misunderstood business valuation, and the critical decision between a holding company structure or trying to preserve the lifetime capital gains exemption by holding shares personally. Whether you're planning to retire with $2 million or aiming for $5 million like this entrepreneur, the episode is going to help you determine if you're building a saleable asset or just building up a well-paying, glorified job. All right, let's dig in. So the backstory here, we had a listener reaching out through our discovery channel on our website. So if you head over to canadianwealthsecrets.com/discovery, you can also submit for a conversation. Now we're going to call this listener Cheryl. And we're modifying some of the numbers just slightly here, but the logic and all the same strategies are going to come into play here. And that's just to, keep them anonymous and ensure that there's no way that someone could be identified here. Now, they reached out, and this is what it said in the booking form. It said, I'm consistently making $1 million a year, and the money is just sitting there. But then after we got into a conversation, we found out that they have about $2 million in assets outside of their primary residence, but they'd actually rather have close to $5 million. So there's kind of two things going on here. They're talking about money sort of sitting in the corporation, but then they're also talking about, some of their wants and their goals in terms of retirement. So we had a lot of things to cover here. But first and foremost, as we dig down this rabbit hole, this individual is a consultant, and it's a technology consulting company. And as I mentioned, does about $1 million of top line revenue. And initially on the call, they stated that they have around a 50% margin, which should mean around $500,000 of net operating income, which would be a very nice amount of profit should they consider selling this business. Now, when we dug in a little bit further, unfortunately, what we found out is that was a 50% margin before paying her and her spouse. Her and her spouse are the primary employees of the business. And after paying themselves, they are left with about $200,000 or about $200,000 of income. Net operating income inside the business. So that profit margin is actually very, very different compared to what was initially stated. This is really important because in their minds, when they had first reached out on the call, they were trying to figure out, first off, what do I do with this sitting money inside the corporate structure? So we've talked about that before on the show. We'll dig into that a little bit further here. But more importantly, there was this idea that the $1 million of revenue is sort of the number that we're going to use in order to determine what this business could be sold for. Now, there's a lot of problems here when we're starting to think about the lifetime capital gains exemption offered here in Canada. For those who are maybe new to that conversation, if you own shares in an active business, an active small business here in Canada, you can actually access your lifetime capital gains exemption if you sell the business, and there's a capital gain of up to $1.25 million. So that's recently changed. It typically changes with inflation over time. It used to be before, a few years back, it used to be less than $1 million. Right now, we're at about $1.25 million, meaning if you sold your business for a $1.25 million, and let's assume that the business was valued at $0 when you first opened this business, there would be a capital gain on that $1.25 million. And basically what this exemption does is it allows you to essentially pay zero tax on $1.25 million. Now, if let's say you sold the business for $2.5 million, right? half of that 1.25 would be tax-free, and the other half would require capital gains to be paid. As of today, as of this recording, you'd have to pay on 50% of that portion above $1.25 million, right? So you're going to pay on half of $1.25 million, but not going to pay 50% in taxes. So you're going to pay your tax rate at whatever half of $1.25 million would be, right? So just over $600,000 would have to be taxed, okay? So there's a huge advantage to utilizing the lifetime capital gains exemption. And a lot of small business owners like myself think about those things and think, I really want to make sure that I'm able to utilize that if I possibly can. However, there's a number of issues that often happen. First off is, how saleable is the company really? So in this particular case, it's a tech company, and basically there's two people in the business doing all of the work. Now, I would argue that they're paying themselves a good wage, and they still have about $200,000 of revenue that, net operating income that is being generated. So there's still some money to be had here. However, we can't really rely on that $1 million of top line revenue number to be sort of in the number that's going to determine how much this business is really worth. And when it came down to it, a lot of the business and the revenue is being generated by contracts. So basically they have to go out and they have to get these contracts. And once they have the contracts, then they fulfill the contracts. And the part that makes this business a little bit challenging is that until they're able to remove themselves from the business, have other people working in the business doing what it is that they do best, which is consulting and technology, until then, it's going to be very difficult to find someone who's going to want to purchase that business, right? Because the purchaser has to figure out, how are we going to replace the husband and wife who are doing all of the work in this particular business, right? There's really no business to be had here. So initially they had these thoughts around being able to sell this business for maybe $1 million, maybe $1.5 million. And that would be fantastic if they can get their business to that place. However, some things that I think are really important to, consider and think about are that the vast majority of Canadian small businesses actually aren't sold. And if they are sold, they're not sold for a significant amount of money because they're not in a position where the business is worth investing in. In this particular case, what we have is we have two people that are creating an amazing business for their lifestyle and their world in order to create income for themselves, as well as to create money to continue to grow their wealth at the same time. Those extra retained earnings can be utilized in order to invest in other assets and to prepare themselves for retirement when they're ready to walk away. Until they actually take the time to systematize this business to one where someone could come in and buy this business and earn money from the business without actually having to run the business themselves. Now, there's varying degrees here when we talk about running the business. Typically, someone would come in, they buy the business. They are going to manage the business, just like a manager of real estate would come in to manage the property, but they're not going to be in the work each and every single day. They want to pay money in order to get a return from that. Nobody wants to go in and actually pay money in order to get a really good job. Right? What they'd be better doing, instead of trying to find a way to sell this business, is really whoever it is that you think might be interested in buying this business is probably better off coming into the business, working in the business, and then you can pay them to be a part of the business. And then over time, you can work out some sort of deal where they might take shares in the company, right? Again, whether it's going to be worth saving or preserving your shares in your personal name for the lifetime capital gains exemption or not is really going to be something that comes down to how likely is it that you're going to be able to sell the business for enough money where the lifetime capital gains exemption really pays off. So what we're going to talk about here is first off, I want to let you know, as of today, according to some research we see here, about 4% of Canadian small businesses are listed for sale. That means about 96% of them are not. Now, that doesn't mean that it could never change, but most businesses aren't actually up for sale or available for sale. Okay. Something that's really also interesting to think about is that only 0.13% of Canadians actually utilize the lifetime capital gains exemption. Now, a lot of people would say, well, a lot of people don't have businesses, so that's going to disqualify them altogether. However, here's something that's really interesting as well, is that when we look at the actual capital gains that a Canadian would create, there's less than 1% of Canadians that actually generate a capital gain of over $250,000 in a given year. So said another way, there's very, very few Canadians that are selling assets, be it businesses, real estate, anything, for over $250,000 in a given year. So when you think about that and you think about how little or how low that number is, how realistic is it that you're going to actually benefit from this particular tax savings? Now, on $1.25 million, right? If we think about that $1.25 million and the capital gains tax that you'd pay on $1.25 million, you're looking at paying just over $300,000 in tax if you were to sell the business without utilizing the capital gains exemption. So really, what you have to think about is, first of all, how realistic is it that you'll be able to sell it and maximize the use of the capital gains exemption? And then secondly, how much are you sacrificing from year to year with the money that is, quote unquote, stuck inside the corporate structure? So rather than holding those shares personally, for the vast majority of business owners that we work with, we often recommend that they put a holding company in place, and the holding company actually owns shares in the operating company. Any of those retained earnings from year to year can flow up to the holding company tax-free. They can stay there. They can be protected from liability should the operating company get sued or have any legal issues. And you can then take those dollars and invest them however you choose. Now, there are nuances, as we've discussed before, right? We do not want to create any unnecessary passive income inside either of the corporations, inside the operating company or the holding company. Something else worth mentioning is that even if you personally hold the shares in your operating company in order to utilize the lifetime capital gains exemption, more than half of the operating businesses in Canada actually don't qualify for the lifetime capital gains exemption because there are some nuances that have to happen. One being that the majority, and really what it is 90% of the operating income inside of the business should be active. All right. Now, there are some other nuances here. We're not going to get into them here today, but ultimately over time, basically what that's saying is you have to make sure that you're not generating more than 10% in passive income compared to the overall revenue being generated in the business in order for that to take place. Now, there are ways to cleanse and there are ways to make sure that, you get your business ready for sale. Typically, you want to make sure that you meet all the requirements for at least 2 years prior to the sale. So sometimes that will delay sales and so forth. But if you have a runway of longer than, say, 2 years in a business that is generating a significant amount of income that has retained earnings that are worth keeping in the corporation rather than, say, losing 40% of them to more dividends or any other type of tax that you might incur, you're better off to keep them inside of the corporate structure, ideally in a holding company, grow your assets there. And if and when you do run into the situation where you are able to sell your business for a significant capital gain, then you can look at what needs to be done in order to make sure that the business is ready for that sale and still qualifies for the lifetime capital gains exemption. There are things such as share rollovers that can be done, and there's all kinds of strategies that can be done to ultimately sort of reverse the holding company holding the shares of the operating company in order to preserve the lifetime capital gains exemption. Now, you all know me if you've been here for a while. I'm a numbers guy. I used to be a high school math teacher, and I love probability. And when I look at the probability of your business actually selling for a significant capital gain, for a significant multiple that makes it worth selling the business, I would much rather set up my corporate structure to build my wealth within the corporate structure. We're not going to keep everything in there. We're still going to take money out as it makes sense, and we're going to stuff other buckets as well. But I'm going to put my money on that I'm probably not going to be able to sell my business for the multiples that I might like or might want in order to sell them. On the other hand as well, if your business is saleable, and if someone's willing to pay a good multiple for it, it's probably because your business is very hands-off. It means that you've systematized the business so well that it's creating what people like to call passive income. Now, nothing is actually passive. We know that, but it's creating enough income without doing a whole lot of work that someone finds value in it. If that's the case, the question then becomes, why don't you just keep it? And if you can design your business and get yourself to a place where you can fully remove yourself from the day-to-day operations of the business, you don't necessarily need to sell your business and you don't need to take some big multiple, because if it's a worthwhile multiple, it should be over $1.25 million in capital gains that you're going to have to pay, which means there's still going to be tax to pay. And guess what? After you pay those taxes, you then have to take this big chunk of money and then you have to decide, what am I going to invest it in? And if your thought is into a business, well, guess what? You already have one and you already made sure that it was optimal so that you can live the lifestyle you want without putting in all of the sweat, tears, and effort into the business from day to day. So hopefully you found this helpful, my friends. If you are interested in having your situation reviewed and to essentially have just a holistic wealth management planning call, you should head on over to CanadianWealthSecrets.com/discovery. If you do not have an incorporated business, you still qualify to hop onto a discovery call. We are getting a little more selective, I must say. So if, for example, you have yet to fill up some of the most obvious buckets for those who don't have a business, such as the tax-free savings account or the RRSP, we may not be able to fit you into the schedule at this time. However, if you've been growing your assets and you're looking for another eye to be able to look at your situation and to understand essentially where you should be going next in your wealth building journey, you should definitely head on over to CanadianWealthSecrets.com/discovery to book your discovery call. Now, if you're just curious on where you are and where you need to go next in your journey, you can head over to CanadianWealthSecrets.com/pathways in order to take our pathways assessment, where you will be provided with a Canadian business owner financial health report, and it'll be sent straight to your email address. We appreciate you all. Ratings and reviews go a long way, and we look forward to hanging out with you in the next episode.